the thing was to bring like Vs and Explorers to the market because they weren't, cool. These body styles were kind of non-existent at the time, but put features in them that were in like old Les Pauls, like the flame maple tops, binding, ebony boards, a cool, a good feeling neck, a good shaped neck. Like I said, Gibson was kind of out of touch in those days. Good pickups. I mean, they had, DiMarzio was just getting on the scene, and all of a sudden you could put a set of pickups in the guitar and really get a sound. So we're just, the concept was to just make a really cool guitar for the times, something that was stage worthy, that I should say, today we call them pointy guitars, but in those days, it was just a flying V or an Explorer with a, that played and felt and sounded great. And that, that was really the impetus of Dean Guitars, really just to make really cool guitars with all these sought after features, kind of just putting everything together properly.
In 1976, a 19-year-old Dean Zelinsky started Dean Guitars.
People were seeking out vintage instruments. The problem is this was the 70s, and Gibson was owned by Norland, and Fender was owned by CBS, and those guys didn't even know what they had. And when I, started Dean Guitars, it was really based on guitars that were, the feel and things that were created in the 50s and 60s, but we kind of hybrided it into, a new body style or something like that. So,
quote, "When I started out, Vs and Explorers were getting popular with reissues, but I felt the big companies were making garbage. They wouldn't put the good stuff into them. So I decided to make nice ones with good parts. At the same time, I knew I had to come out with an original model so people would know this wasn't just another copy company." Inspired by the untimely passing of his childhood friend Matthew Lynn and having visited Gibson's Kalamazoo factory, Dean would merge the Explorer and Flying V shapes together to create the ML model, arguably Dean's most iconic guitar. Quote, "My idea was to have a stage look with a radical body style and finishes so brilliant that they would light up on stage. I was tired of going to concerts and seeing the same old guitars. It bothered me to death to see an act open up with players appearing out of smoke on a stage with 100,000 watts of lights, laser beams, and everyone suited up like you'd only see at a rock performance. And there'd be the guitarist playing something that was designed before rock was. It was a generation gap, clean and simple." The ML would be paired with Dean's now infamous BFH, or Big headstock, itself a tribute to the Gibson split headstock found on a small number of early 1958 Explorers. Quote, "I had seen a guitar with an asymmetrical V head, and I thought it was kind of cool but weird. I played around with different headstock designs, including one that was an arrowhead design with the wings of the V coming down past the nut into the playing area. When I put on the symmetrical V, I thought it looked killer and knew everyone would know from the back row in the biggest auditorium the guy was playing a Dean."
I knew, I looked at the V one day and I said, boy, that would make a cool headstock upside down. And, I came up with the V-shaped head on the original Deans, which the original one was huge, by the way, because it was based on the body, I think. And, the world was, it's like anything new. Some of the people thought it was cool, and a lot of people were like, whoa.
The ML, along with the accompanying V and Z models, would make their debut at the 1977 Winter NAMM show in Anaheim, California.
First of all, I had to get out there. I was 19 years old. I built like a dozen guitars. I put them in a Chevy van, built the booth, put everything in a Chevy van, and my friend and I drove out to California from Chicago, which is, I guess, a 4-day trip if you do it properly. Freezing cold, middle of winter. In those days, this was the hippie van, but it was like a cargo van. They didn't have much heat. So I had rigged up this deal where I had, it had two vents in the defrosters, and I'd busted out one of them and put a shop vac hose in there. And literally, when I used to drive in the winter, you didn't get enough heat in this thing, so you'd stick the shop vac hose under your coat, and that's how you kept warm. So my friend and I really trucked all the way out to the West Coast, sharing this, okay, your turn, my turn, with this hose. Well, I guess I probably knew better in the days, because I had seen a lot of guitars with finish cracks. But, cold weather doesn't, and lacquer doesn't meld well. And when I got out there, all the guitars were cracked. A nightmare, by the way, nightmare thing. So all I did is, we set up the booth. It was a 10 by 10 booth. I took the 3 okay guitars, tied them to the wall, so that nobody, and I had the one good guitar, and that was my demo guitar. And I got through the NAMM show. And I did, I think it was a 3-day show at the time. In 3 days, I walked out there with $45,000 worth of guitar, $45,000 worth of sales. The first guy to actually place an order for a Dean guitar was Jerry Ash of Sam Ash Music. I'd run a little teaser ad in a magazine. Jerry Ash responded, which was kind of cool because he was probably just a really sharp guy who kind of like was cutting edge and used to look in the back of magazines and stuff. And he had called me up and he said, hey, if your guitars are as good as they say they are, I'm going to buy them. I said they are. And he literally came to the show and ordered 3 guitars. It was my first order, so I thought that was kind of cool.
Let's take a bit of a diversion here. If you watch the Hamer Guitars video we put out, you'll note that at the same 1977 NAMM show, Hamer was also there debuting their new Sunburst model. Hamer was also inspired by Gibson's past, with their Standard and Sunburst guitars being modeled after the Explorer and double cutaway Les Paul Jr. Hamer Guitars had recently moved to Palatine, Illinois, with Paul Hamer and business partner Joel Danzig deciding to close up their vintage guitar shop in Wilmette and devote their full-time energy to building guitars. After the 1977 Winter NAMM show, Dean Guitars would start production in Evanston, Illinois, about 20 miles from Hamer Guitars in Palatine.
Hamer and Dean were super competitive, really competitive. And even though I never got in that, I remember Dean always looking at what Hamer was doing when I was there and being, Hamer had a video. Dean was like, okay, we got to get more of this stuff because look at Hamer, and it was probably because they both were in the same era. I can't tell you. He never said anything bad. But it was really competitive.
Stepping back a few years to the early 70s, a young Dean Zelinsky and friend Matthew Lynn would take guitar lessons from Paul Hamer.
There was this local rock band in Chicago, and Paul Hamer and this guy Gary Gand were in the band, and they were like 16-ish. Gary Gand's Bob had the Village School of Folk Music, and everything was kind of like being born out of there. Gary was a rocker, and he was in a band with Paul Hamer, who was a rocker. So this whole, this was when rock music was relatively new. And everything kind of got born out of there. Actually, I started taking lessons from Paul Hamer, quit him, went to Gary, and Paul got pissed at me. And I mean, I was like 13. He was like, maybe 17 or something at the time. And
Gary Gand went to school with Paul Hamer at Deerfield High School, and the two became friends after both were kicked out of high school for having long hair.
So I was one of the few kids in the school that had long hair, and one day I got thrown out. The assistant principal grabbed me, sent me home.
Now this was the hippie days. Paul Hamer had hair down his ass, wore pink nail polish, and wore chick clothes. But they were like, emulating the British rock invasion, at the time. So
let's see, it was January in 1968. The high school rounded up all the long hairs, which was me, Paul Hamer, the Woker brothers, bunch of guys with long sideburns, anybody that was outside of the norm. And there were about 8 of us. And we all got rounded up one day. They brought us into a room and they suspended us. They kicked us out of school for having long hair. The next thing we know, there's an article in the paper about Paul Hamer's dad, who's an attorney, and he's decided to sue the school over the dress code, saying it's unconstitutional. My dad talks to Paul's dad, because they're trying to plot how we're going to win this thing, and they kind of hit it off. And the next thing I know, Paul is teaching guitar at my dad's studio. So Paul's dad, sued, and he won.
He settled on $1 on principle. He wanted to have the school district write him a check for $1. I thought it was pretty cool.
And, back in the day, I used to say, and that was the beginning of the end, because from that point on, all the kids in high school just looked like hell.
When I was like 16-ish, I was getting part-time jobs and stuff, and I actually went to Gary Gand, who now had a music store born out of his father's place, and I said, hey, can I do some repair work for you? He's like, you know how to repair guitars? I said, yeah. So he comes out with this SG case. He opens it up, and this is a guitar that somebody had smashed against the foundation floor. He said, can you put it back together? And I said, yeah. So I literally rebuilt the whole cavity, control cavity, put the neck on, did the whole thing, painted the thing, and I don't know how long it took me, but, I brought it back all like a guitar again. He was pretty impressed. And then I ended up doing all his repair work for a while, which kind of got me through high school.
When Zelinsky travels to the 1977 Winter NAMM show, he would ask Gary and Gary's wife Joan to fly out in advance to help, as the couple had attended multiple NAMM shows in the past. Both Gary and Joan being accomplished musicians, they were also able to provide music for the booth to help showcase the guitars and also to provide musical entertainment for the after-hours party, hosted by the still underage Zelinsky.
Now, you got to remember, I'm like 19, 20 when these are going on. I looked 16. I always looked 4 or 5 years younger. We would literally just go in and throw the beds up against the wall, 3-room suite, throw the beds up against the wall, bring in a bunch of alcohol, and of course, a lot of noise in a hotel, rock band playing, jam, all these guys, and then we'd get busted in no time. So one time I'm in there and, party security comes up, whose suite is this? I'm step up, it's mine. Well, they didn't believe me because I said, it's mine. I look like 16. There's no way. It's whose suite is this? So I just walked away. They wouldn't believe me, so I went up to the bar. Let the party go, because, and I never got in trouble for it, really.
Now, Dean Zelinsky goes into this Winter NAMM 1977 story in far greater detail on his YouTube channel, which I highly recommend, and I'll put a link down below. With orders from the NAMM show in hand, Dean Guitars would open up a production shop on 2125 Dewey Avenue in Evanston, Illinois. Quote, about 3,200 square feet on the second floor. We had to haul machinery up with a winch through a hatch in the floor.
Well, there's actually a whole story before that, because I spent a year trying to build the guitars to get to the NAMM show, to develop the lines. My only formal guitar manufacturing experience was two tours of the Gibson factory.
The Standard Series, consisting of Dean Guitars ML, Z, and V models, would be introduced to the general public at a retail price between $879 to $899 that included the hard case. Quote, standard models are topped with 2-piece curly maple, quarter sawn to maximize grain qualities. Fingerboards are ebony, dotted with abalone. The great Dean sound is shaped by 2 specially made DiMarzio humbucking pickups. Maximum ability to sustain is achieved through our unique head styling, patents pending, among other design factors.
So this guitar came out in 1977. As you can see, it's got what we call a Series 1 headstock. It's the really jumbo headstock. And double cream bobbins, that was what the early Deans used. The serialized nomenclature started at 101, so this being 127 is actually guitar number 27. So that's the V, which was one of the first guitars that the company built, and of course the distinctive V headstock that can be seen from so far away. Then you can see this V headstock way in the back of the stadium.
Dean Zelinsky, 21, has been manufacturing rock guitars for only a year and a half, and already his customers include Dave Mason and Kansas lead guitarist Kerry Livgren. I was at a trade show when Livgren stopped by, and I asked him to try a Dean guitar, recounts Zelinsky. 3 days later, he ordered one to be rushed to him for the start of Kansas's tour.
The NAMM show was down in Atlanta that year, the summer show, and the guys happened to live in Atlanta. The band Kansas had just moved to Atlanta. And, Kerry Livgren walks by my booth. So Kerry's like, I have a conversation, and he leaves, A few days later, I get a phone call from Kerry Livgren in Kansas. Like, hey, played all the guitars at the NAMM show. I liked yours the best. I'm like, whoa, cool. He says, well, I'm leaving for a tour. He says, I'd like that one that I played, that one. And I'm like, okay. He said, but I'm leaving. I said, well, I'll ship you the guitar today. Just send me the check. And he's like, cool.
I shipped the guitar he chose at the show, and the 12th or 13th Dean ever made was on tour with the #1 selling band in America. This instantly put us on the map. I went to a Kansas concert and saw my creation on stage for the first time. To make an instrument good to the last fret, as he puts it, requires 6 weeks, and Zelinsky's 8 employees produce 80 a month. With a little help from his family, his mother keeps the books, Dean was ready. I can't knock a good Gibson, he says of his top-selling competitor. They have always been the best, but he isn't daunted. The logo on his product has wings sprouting from the Dean. That's the way my guitars sound, Zelinsky explains. they soar. The E-Lite would debut in 1978 with a list price of $699. Quote, "That's just a word, like elite. I've been using a long time. Anything I saw that had class, I'd call E-Lite." Both the E-Lite and the 1979 debut of the Flame series, priced at $669 that year, would feature guitars with Clouson tuners instead of Grovers, no maple tops or body binding, and rosewood fingerboards instead of ebony as a way to offer a lower-priced option for dealers and consumers alike. The E-Lite series would also expand in 1979, starting with the Golden E-Lite, featuring upgraded body binding and gold hardware, along with the first appearance of the Cadillac. Today, Dean Guitars refers to any guitar with the merged Explorer and Les Paul shape as a Cadillac, but when introduced, the Cadillac was the top-end model of the Dean line.
This one is a 3-pickup black Cadillac, gold hardware, and the significance of this guitar is that this guitar was actually the NAMM prototype that was shown at NAMM at the 1980 show.
The Cadillac featured 7-ply binding on the body, 5-ply binding on the headstock, 3 DiMarzio pickups, a built-in preamp, Grover tuners, and priced for retail at $1299.
The original guitars came stock with DiMarzios. That was a big deal back in the day.
That was a big deal.
Because we didn't have to go in and buy them and install them. These guitars came hot rodded right out of the box.
That's right.
You know, and that was a big deal, that you could go into a store and have those super hot pickups already installed in the instrument, not have to, you know, take apart your old guitar and have new pickups put in.
I don't know, I heard about DiMarzio, probably through music stores, you know, where I used to hang out at Gary Gand Music. He probably found out about DiMarzio pickups. You know, when I started Dean, you know, I just called Larry DiMarzio and said, hey, I want to put them in my guitars, which we did. My guitars were about $100 more than a Les Paul at the time, so it was economical because mine already had the pickups they wanted in it. So.
It seemed like anything that was equipped with DiMarzios was just you know, like already just holy grail.
Sure.
And all of our heroes certainly were playing DiMarzio pickups, whether it was Kiss or whoever it was. Like, they were all had DiMarzios installed, and you know, Larry DiMarzio is kind of a legend from New York. We're New York guys. Like, you know, like I'd hear about him being on 48th Street.
Yeah. Oh yeah. There was this whole myth and lore behind DiMarzio's stuff back then. You know.
Some interesting trivia. All 1977, 78, and some early 1979 Dean guitars had red side dot markers on the neck. These side dot markers were actually from a game called Space Clusters. This product came with a series of plastic sticks and intersections that assembled to form 3-dimensional shapes. This game was developed by Michael Evans out of Chicago and was sold mostly in museums and planetariums starting around 1974. The red sticks would be cut to size and used for their side dot markers. Allegedly, Zelinsky had a friend whose father owned a toy shop where these games were sourced. Once that source was dried up in 1979, Dean guitars would change over to the standard black side dots. Speaking of changes, the V headstock would go through its first redesign sometime in 1978, with the volute being added early in 1979. These would be referred to as the Series 2 headstocks. By 1980, Zelinsky has already dealt with problems ranging from bounced retailer checks, a stolen shipment of ebony from a shipping dock, and the abrupt closure of its previous hardcase manufacturer. Quote, "What possessed a 19-year-old kid with no business experience and no background in mass production to start a guitar manufacturing concern on the second floor of a converted trunk bumper factory? It was a combination of factors. 1, the firmly held conviction that he could produce a superior product. 2, the existence of $100,000 in venture capital. And 3, a touch of wild-eyed optimism. An example of that optimism is Dean's belief that within a scant 3 years, we'll control the rock guitar market in this country." Dean's optimism is encouraging, but the 1980s will come with many challenges.
I'm speaking to you tonight to give you a report on the state of our nation's economy, and regret to say that we're in the worst economic mess since the Great Depression. Now, we've just had 2 years of back-to-back double-digit inflation, 13.3% in 1979, 12.4% last year. In 1960, mortgage interest rates averaged about 6%. They're 2.5 times as high now, 15.4%. And finally, there are 7 million Americans caught up in the personal indignity and human tragedy of unemployment.
Despite the economic downturn, By 1982, Dean had moved to an 11,000 square foot facility in Chicago, grown to 25 employees, producing 50 guitars a week with a list of over 300 dealers and a growing artist roster.
I remember just shows like just Saturday Night Special and maybe like the old Saturday Night Lives, and that's where you'd see these guitars.
Yeah,
so Kerry Livgren of Kansas had this. So Carry On Wayward Son was their, I guess, their biggest song, and he was playing one of these in Cherry Sunburst. John McVie of the Doobie Brothers.
Correct.
Had one.
He had quite a few of them. Yeah, he ran the gamut of them. He was like a big endorsee at the time, and I remember seeing him playing MLs and Cadillacs, a lot of Cadillacs. Yeah, this stuff was just amazing.
And not a metal band, Doobie Brothers, right? So like, it's just
not a metal band.
And Kansas was a rock band, if anything, right?
Right.
Elliot Easton of the Cars.
Correct.
Probably the most famous.
Quote, "As far as my Gibson type sounds go, I've been going to Dean Zelinsky. My custom ML, which is my main guitar, is all cherry, red flames. It has a bound peg head and block inlays, and Dean signed it. He just gave me a baby blue Flying V with all gold hardware. He even had the strings gold plated. I think that Dean's guitars are louder and fatter sounding than Gibson's. I like his radical body designs and I love his finishes. He's a really nice cat to work with." Elliot Easton of the Cars. I once made the most gorgeous Dean for him that had gold parts, gold strings, gold inlays, etc. And at a Madison Square Garden concert, he smashes it on stage. Then he calls me up and wants a new one.
Elliot was maybe the second endorser of Dean, definitely one of the biggest, but maybe the second. The Cars were huge. Dean Guitars was just getting off. We actually our careers kind of started breaking at the same time.
That's right.
Elliot called me up one day. He lived in Boston, and Rick Ocasek. He goes, "This is Elliot Easton from the Cars." He goes, "I just got Rick Ocasek, a guitar, but I'm left-handed. Can you build me one?" And and Elliot described the guitar he wanted over the phone, and I built it.
I built it, and then you delivered it to Cherokee Studios in L.A. while we were doing Candio. And I took it out of the case and I plugged it in and I started recording with it that day. Remember?
No, I remember that.
Right away, we put it on a record.
And you know what? I was listening to the record being recorded. I said, you guys are going to be big.
Yeah. There's some potential there.
Potential there, yes. It's weird because I was driving in Chicago and that song, that Cars song, doom, 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 comes on the radio, and it was so unique and it was so cool. And I'm with a friend of mine. I remember I was driving to a place called the Silo Pizza place. Silo Pizza, it's in the Chicago area.
S-I-L-O.
S-I-L-O, yeah, they owe me money. And I said, I'm going to get these guys to play my guitars. And I was like new in the business. It wasn't like I went out and got endorsers every day. I swear it was like a week later he calls me.
You can't make this stuff up.
No, you can't. Yeah.
Well, you could.
Quote, "The young entrepreneur is also trying to interest legendary guitarist Eric Clapton in using a Dean instrument. However, Zelinsky knows his company cannot offer these stars as much money to endorse the product as the big companies can. Therefore, he's happy to have a rock star endorse another brand just as long as he or she uses a Dean on stage." Even with the increase of sales and production, Zelinsky knew he had a long way to go to compete with brands like Gibson and Fender.
And they were hard to find, too.
Correct. You'd go into a store, any major store, and a lot of Gibson, a lot of Fender on the wall, but every once in a while you would see one of these in between the common guitars, and that one would stand out. You go, what is that one? I remember the first time I saw an ML was when Sam Ash on Queens Boulevard opened up, and they had a white ML with gold hardware and black binding. And my friend and I went there, and we looked at it like, oh my God, where did this thing come
And you're
from?
talking like that was like 1980 or so.
It was probably 80 or 81, yeah.
Right.
Somewhere in that era, yeah, and that guitar just looked like incredible.
As a kid, they tell you, if you build a better mousetrap, the world will be at a path to your door. So I knew I had a better mousetrap, better neck, better feel, better, cooler design, all that stuff. I don't know if I set up a better sound. And I'd call a music store, and I'd say, hey, how you doing with my guitars? Oh, great, we sold one last month. Good, how many Les Pauls do you sell? About 12. I'm like, well, what's going on? Well, they all play your guitar. They say it feels better, plays better, blah, blah, blah. They buy the Les Paul. Whoa, So they're buying brand. So I said, okay, I got to work on making my, I have to change my focus from making better guitars to branding.
Quote, I realized the problem was Dean was not a household name. I had to change my marketing focus to making Dean a household name. The endorsements I was picking up along the way were helping, but it just wasn't enough. I wanted to convey to guitar players, we are not like the other guys. These were not guitars built by a corporation, but a guy in his young 20s just like you. I knew the reason a guy wanted to be a rock star was because rock stars were cool and the cool guys got the chicks. I had to convey this in my advertising. On a flight back from LA, sometime in early 1980, Dean is going through an airline magazine and he comes across the liquor ad with an attractive woman holding a drink. At that moment, Dean has an idea. What if he could use the same concept, but with the woman holding a guitar? Doing so would be a radical departure from his current marketing strategy, which was focused on guitarist endorsements.
You know, interesting, I had a marketing guy at the time, Van Skolnick. He was running the marketing in the company, and things were okay. I come back, I tell him about my idea. He's like, that's cheesecake, don't do it. We're not doing it. I said, we're doing it. And, he was totally against it. And it really ended our relationship, professionally and, whatnot, because I was going to go do this ad.
Dean Guitars would debut their infamous Lady in the Water ad in the February 1981 issue of Guitar Player magazine.
And it created more noise in the industry than you would believe. What was going on is everybody in the music stores, when people were walking, do you see the girl in the Dean ad? Do you see the girl in the Dean ad? A lot of noise in the music stores. But more importantly, the letters to the editor started pouring in. And it just dominated that column about Dean's ads being sexist, and obviously the pros and cons on both sides. So it ran like 7-8 months of editorial was pretty much dedicated to my ad.
Quote, despite Jim Crockett's editorial in the May 81 issue, I still feel the ad for Dean Guitars should have been rejected. Its erotic approach to sales is not only in poor taste, it demeans both men and women. Your magazine should be able to reject this kind of crap. Follow Sunset Magazine's ad criterion and you'll find yourself ahead of the game in the long run. Honestly, what is so terrible about attractive women appearing in Guitar Player? As for the pseudo-intellectuals who scream about exploitation, I seriously doubt that any of the models in these ads were forced against their own wills to pose. Shoot, for a few bucks and my picture in a fine national magazine like Guitar Player, I'd be glad to don a swimming suit and hold a guitar in my hands. Of course, with my beard and hairy legs, the effect may not be the same. As far as manufacturers are concerned, tell them that many of us are turned away from buying their products by sexist advertising. You may call that closed-minded, but I think I should stand behind what I believe. As for the persons who enjoy barely dressed females, they can buy Playboy and get all the nudes their heart desires. As for GP, I say chuck the stuff. My name is Christine, I'm female, and I'm a guitarist. I own 3 electrics, one of which happens to be a Dean. Now, you know damn well I didn't buy that guitar because I saw some girl standing in an ocean caressing one like it was her main squeeze. In fact, I don't really care one way or another. I bought this X because it looked beautiful, sounded hot, and the price was right. There will always be morons who will buy some cheapie because they saw some gorgeous chick standing in a puddle of water holding one, but we all know that the serious guitarist buys with 3 senses: hearing, sight, and touch. If the Dean people decide to change their approach, my Silver V and I, fully clothed of course, will be glad to post for an ad bearing the caption, I may not be pretty, but I play one.
All of a sudden, guitars started moving off the walls. And what happened is I became a household name. It's like, oh, Dean, I've heard of that, because people are just talking about it. And that was, my first lesson in marketing.
The controversial ad would even draw the attention of Playboy magazine, who would cover the situation in a brief 1982 article. Interestingly enough, the model featured in the Dean ad, Sherry Shattuck, was herself featured on the cover of the April 1980 issue, and Dean Zelinsky would even hire a Playboy photographer to shoot the Lady in the Water ad.
Well, first of all, Playboy magazine put that ad in for free. They put it in an article, Our Guitars, because Playboy was hip. And he exploited the fact that this was fashion. And Dean understood that. his logo, that cool logo. And agencies would start coming to us and they go, oh, we're going to be your ad agency. And Dean goes, okay, give me a sample of what you're going to do. And Dean goes, get ready. It's going to be a flying V or the ML in space. And every time these ad agencies, they had no concept. It looks like a spaceship. Well, the Stratocaster was very space age, early advertising, but that's all they knew. So Dean knew that he had a niche, and it was a big niche. He also liked to piss people off.
We started bringing some hot girls that were in our ads. I started bringing them to events, and then, we'd do like an in-store. They'd sign posters and all that stuff.
Playing a guitar makes you cool. The cool guy gets the girl. The cigarette and the liquor companies do this. Budweiser always has gorgeous women in their ads. The implications, hot chicks, came with Budweiser beer. And while Dean wasn't the first guitar company nor the last to use sex appeal in their advertising, Dean guitars would certainly go down in history as the most infamous.
That was a defining moment in my career. Obviously there was, getting a few key endorsements along the way was huge too, but that was probably the defining moment. So, the other direction in advertising was, the craftsman on the bench and he's adjusting the truss rod and all the, to me, rock was young and it was cool and it was like, chicks and all that stuff. And like, who wants to see a guy adjusting a truss rod sighting a neck,
Late 1981 would see the introduction of the shrimp fork headstock, which would debut on the Baby series, which were short-scale variants of the MLV and Z models. Quote, the semi-star-shaped body is constructed of poplar, a durable and dense yet lightweight wood. This model is finished in a premium blue-on-blue sunburst, which is quite striking. Dean terms it blueburst. The pickups are specially designed super distortion humbuckers, which seem to exhibit more tone and character than the super distortion pickups made available by DiMarzio for replacement usage. After a disagreement with workers at Dean Guitars, only about the bobbin covers being colored differently, I had a chat with Dean Zelinsky himself, only to confirm that in fact, the wiring and winding as well have been custom altered to accommodate the entire line of Dean Guitars. The 3-position toggle switch is wired in such a way as to place both pickups out of phase when the selector is in the middle position. A Schaller bridge completes the picture. The set-in neck is also a poplar, a one-piece design. The tuning machines are Schallers, and the 22-fret rosewood fretboard is a full-scale 24 3/4. All in all, for excellent stage presence and rock and roll bite, the Dean ML Baby is a good bet, with prices beginning at $659 suggested retail and $99 suggested retail for the case. Both the shrimp fork headstock and the Baby series were designed by Denny Rowan, a production manager and designer for Dean Guitars. Rowan would both redesign the V headstock to what would be known as the Series 3 headstock and create the shrimp fork headstock to create a less extreme string angle for better tuning stability and possibly to accommodate the recent Kahler locking tremolo systems that Dean began to offer as an extra feature for an additional $249 installed. The Baby would also be the first series that offered an import version to the Dean Guitars line. Starting with the Baby series and possibly through 1986, Dean would offer imported guitars from Japan built at the ESP factory. The move into overseas guitar manufacturing has always been a divisive topic. Beginning in the early 70s and throughout the 80s, the U.S. guitar market was struggling to compete as Japanese brands were selling versions of Les Pauls, Stratocasters, and other popular shapes at a far reduced price compared to their domestic competition.
The first part of it was just taking the quote-unquote copy guitars and making them more accurate as copies. And then, well, if Gibson reintroduces the single-cut Les Paul, let's beat them to it, and we'll reintroduce the old Flying V and the old Explorer and a lot of stuff that isn't even available from the big guys anymore that was beginning to be highly sought after and cool and all of that. So we had a big smashing success with that. It was funny, we didn't consider the big guys, Gibson and Fender, that much our competitors, but a lot of the smaller companies and the newer companies, Ovation making guitars, Paul Reed Smith, Hamer, Dean, all of these kind of specialty brands that came up in the 70s.
Quote, when I started Dean, there was always foreign competition. Ibanez was cutting its teeth doing copies of Gibsons that were better than Gibsons. The difference was all of us U.S. makers fought the foreign competition, and they were having trouble getting market share. This all changed when Fender decided to go offshore. As soon as there was a Strat for $369, it all changed. The solution for many U.S. guitar companies became a if you can't beat 'em, join 'em mentality, as Fender would join Dean in having guitars produced in Japan starting in 1982 as well. The newly formed Fender Japan would even source their guitars from the very same factories producing the copycat models they were struggling to compete against back home. Gibson had actually started importing guitars in the early 70s by having many of their Epiphone models produced in Japan. As mentioned earlier, consumer perception has always been divided regarding overseas guitar building, and for Dean this would be no different. However, this move would help put Dean guitars into more players' hands and increase the number of guitars they were able to produce. Keep in mind, the price of a standard USA-made ML, V, or Z was going for around $1,100 in 1982, which was about the price of a Les Paul Custom at that time. With the U.S. economy still climbing out of a recession, asking a customer to spend the equivalent of $3,600 in 2025 would put these guitars out of reach for most Americans back then as well as today. Despite the ongoing recession, despite the opposition towards the new imported guitars, and even despite the criticism toward the sexually provocative advertising, if one was to pinpoint a peak for Dean guitars during Zelinsky's era, one could make a great argument for the years 1983 and 1984. Now, in order to tell this next story, we'll need to bring in some new characters. That being 1. William Billy Frederick Gibbons, Joe Michael Dusty Hill, and Frank Lee Beard, Houston's own ZZ Top.
Something that makes really people nervous about you guys is the story of this name, ZZ Top. And I know that you never wanted to say anything about it. Want you to change something today?
We will tell 3 stories about it, but none of them will be true. Let's see.
You know what
we
ZZ
chose
means?
ZZ Top because it would be the very last record in the record bins. When you go to the store and it's alphabetically ZZ would be the last record in the bins. Really?
It was really 22 Top. They just confused the letters with the numbers.
Dusty?
They have rolling papers, zigzag papers, and top papers. Do you believe any of those?
We have more.
We have more.
At some point in the late 70s, Zelinsky met Billy Gibbons, and according to Zelinsky, the two would talk often on the phone. At one point in the early 80s, Dean had a custom wine Red ML made for Billy. Dean would detail the specs in an August 1984 issue of Guitar Player magazine. Billy's guitar is a specially made ML standard that was double bound with binding in the front and back. It has a special neck Billy wanted, big and chunky, like a baseball bat cut in half. The guitar's pickups are our standard Dean humbuckers. Dear Dean, we recently got a break from our touring schedule and time to return and find your beautiful Dean guitar. I'm looking forward to resume touring and be able to give it a few whacks. It sure is a pretty thing. Kindest personal regards, Billy Gibbons. Sometime in 1982, Zelinsky gets a call from Billy telling Dean he's been playing the ML on some new tracks he's recording and asks Dean to fly down to Houston to listen to the demos. Dean recalls hearing a demo of Legs in Billy's SL Mercedes, and Billy would later tell him the entire Eliminator album was recorded with that wine red ML. Billy would tell Guitar Player magazine, "We used double Deans on that, believe it or not. Bass and guitar were both Deans. A couple of oddballs that Dean had whipped up for us, some custom jobs that were similar to that Dean ML." Now, it's worth mentioning that Terry Manning, the producer on Eliminator, remembers this differently and has stated that Billy used 2 Deans on the studio recordings. Quote, "There were 2 Deans which we employed. One was somewhat like a cross between a flying V and a modern shape, very long ears, and the other was sort of a warped, pointy Stratocaster-y shape. Both guitars had a single DiMarzio Super Distortion, high output pickup, and almost no controls. I don't even think there was a tone control. What would you need one for? They have big, heavy brass bridge / tailpieces bolted into the body. Billy has the first one mentioned, and he gave me the latter, which I still have."
We had 2 Dean guitars that we used throughout the album for 99.9% of all the tracks, with the same pickups on the same guitar, or the other one just about like it. And I will say this at this point, too. We used 1 amplifier only, a small fairly small amplifier, 50-watt amp with one 12-inch speaker. and one microphone in one position, whether we were doing leads, full lead guitar, rhythm guitar, any overdub, initial guitar, anything we did, exact same setup. Nothing changed, which doesn't ever happen.
Yeah.
But we just said, boy, this works. Don't move anything. Don't touch anything. Leave it there.
Mm-hmm.
So this guitar, we're playing very loud over these huge JBL studio speakers, the monitors. And the guitar is so highly strung, to use an odd metaphor there, but that if he let go of the strings at any point, start feeding back really loud. If he picked up his fingers to change chords, we would get this to the next chord, get that going. So I got phone calls from Dire Straits, Eddie Van Halen called, Ted Nugent called. When after that album was out, called me up and said, just tell me how you got that sound. I need that sound.
In March of 1983, Eliminator would be released, spawning 4 hit singles, and would eventually sell in excess of 20 million records worldwide, making it ZZ Top's most commercially successful album to date. Not only were Dean guitars used on the record, but they were also featured heavily on the Eliminator tour that would kick off in May of 1983. This came about after the band had an entire semi-truck load of equipment stolen the day after their May 7th show in Lake Charles, Louisiana. This missing trailer contained all the guitars, basses, amps, drums, and various pieces of staging equipment. Dean Guitars would step in quickly to provide custom sets of Z models to Billy and Dusty. These babies were painted with fluorescent paint. They had UV spotlights. When the stage was dark, the guitars would light up as if there were bulbs inside. This was quite an effect created by Gibbons. All you would see is illuminated guitars lighting up their beards. The Red Z's were not only featured on tour, but on the 45 single cover of Sharp Dressed Man and on multiple TV appearances made during this time. However, neither the red or yellow Z models would be nearly as well known as the next set of guitars Dean would produce for the band. At some point in late '83, Dean Zelinsky is on the phone with Billy Gibbons.
Before he hangs up, he gets back on the phone. He says, yeah, I'm going to send you some sheepskins. I want you to put them on some guitars. I'm like, okay. Got them in Scotland. I'm like, okay.
We get a box, and Dean opens it up, and it's from Lone Star Productions, which is Billy's company, their management, and it's fur, right? So you know where it's leading. But Dean calls in his office, and he goes, we got fur from Billy. We're going to call him. So we call Billy.
Work out the details. And
you want a fur guitar? And Billy goes, I'll never forget. Billy goes, yeah, I want to make them spin. Just like that voice, and we're laughing.
Literally, then he's like, hey, we really need these guitars. Gluing them on. Literally, the FedEx driver was there waiting to pick up the guitars, and we're still gluing the fur on the tuning keys. And overnighted them to this video set, and they shot the Legs video.
The result is the infamous furry spinning guitars featured in the video for Legs, the 4th and final single released for the Eliminator album. The video would be released in May of 1984, and the song would end up being ZZ Top's highest charting single of all time.
Billy used to give us keychains. In the video with the cars, he'd throw that key. He'd give those to Dean and I, and they were legal tender. Anywhere we went, Dean goes, we work with ZZ Top. And they're like, oh, yeah, I'm sure you do. And Dean goes, here's the keychain again. We're like, can I keep that?
ZZ Top would also take home the MTV Video of the Year award at the first ever MTV Video Awards show and would mime a performance to Sharp Dressed Man, appearing with a custom rhinestone set of Dean Z's.
This is the first year of the MTV Video Awards. And ZZ Top was going to be the big band playing. So, we had to come up with another idea. So I made him guitars totally covered with rhinestones on the whole face.
My daughter remembers that she was 5 or 6, and I picked her up from school. And I said, we have to go deliver these guitars because MTV is going to have their awards, and Billy doesn't want to play the fur. He wants to play these diamond rhinestone guitars, which Dean did. So I get to the airport, and Dean's, I got to pick my daughter up. My wife can't do it. Dean goes, okay, you get to the airport, So I get it there. My daughter's tag along with me, and I go, and they said, for the cartage or whatever it was, we had 2 road cases, one bass, one guitar. And the guy's out there, and they go, it's too late. And I see the guy on the tarmac, he's loading stuff. And I go, hey, can you come over here? And he goes, yeah. And I go, I got to get this on the plane. And the guy's like, oh, I can't do it, just the baggage handler. I go, if you don't get this on the plane, ZZ Top's not playing tonight. And he goes, what? And it was sunny on the right outside the gate. And I open it up, and the sun hits this rhinestone. It was blinding, like, and the guy goes, get out of the way, I got ZZ Top's guitars, And so we get home that night, probably 4 hours later, 5 hours later, we turn on the MTV First Awards, and there's ZZ Top playing the guitars,
Your music cuts away across all fashions and trends, and in fact, you don't give a shit about punk or funk or new romantics, I don't know. And but are you aware of what's happening at the moment on the musical scene?
They're all growing beards.
Getting back to 1983, Dean guitarists would debut the Bel Air. This model would feature what is possibly the first production guitar to come equipped with a humbucker pickup in the bridge along with single coil pickups in the middle and neck position. Quote, the Bel Air is Dean's prime newcomer for 1983. This double cutaway comes with 2 single coils and 1 humbucker, a maple or rosewood fingerboard, and a standard tremolo system. In addition, it features 3 on-a-side Goto machine heads, a 5-position selector switch, and 2 volume 1-tone control switch. The Bel Air would debut at a list price of $499, with the base version at $799 list price. Quote, the Bel Air was our answer to the Strat-type bolt-on neck. The bodies were made, painted, and assembled in Chicago, while the necks were from Japan. Dean Guitars would also begin offering custom colors for $149 and even hand-painted zebra finishes for an additional $399. Quote, news from Dean Guitars. From now on, production models will have the smaller peghead found on the recently produced Bel Air, rather than the much larger V-shaped design associated with the Chicago company since its inception. We'll introduce the V-shape from time to time, explains founder-president Dean Zelinsky, but only on a limited basis. Dean Guitars had even expanded into the accessories market in the early 80s, selling guitar straps, picks, hats, shirts, jackets, and even Dean-branded strings. Quote, designer Dean Zelinsky assures me that his new Dean Baby Deluxe guitar really is one of his most in-demand instruments at the moment. The original design concept behind Dean's Baby series was based on the demand for a radical, stagey guitar that was no bigger than a Les Paul. The Baby starts with a poplar body, adds 2 DiMarzio Super Distortion type humbuckers, a 24 3/4 scale length, body binding, ebony fingerboard, plus inlays, high quality hardware, and the ever popular Kahler locking tremolo system as an extra option. Hot colors and graphics round out this unabashedly now little gem that manages to pack all of today's hottest design options into its teeny little body. From the outside looking in, things seem to be looking good for Dean Guitars. New redesigned headstocks, double locking Kahler tremolos to attract the hard rock customers, new custom colors, and new models like the Bel Air to compete with the rising trend of bolt-on Super Strat style guitars. However, unbeknownst to Dean Zelinsky or anyone else in the guitar world, a storm was brewing that would threaten the electric guitar's dominance in rock music through the rest of the decade.